a balmy day in the fall of 1950, in the quiet Kansas town of Topeka, when a mild-mannered black man took his plump 7-year-old daughter by the hand and walked briskly 4 blocks from their home to the all-white school and tried without success to enroll his child. The child of whom I speak was I, Linda Carroll Brown, and my father, the late Reverend Oliver Leon Brown. Black parents in Topeka felt that the day of trying to enroll their children in the school nearest to their home was long overdue. Many were the evenings my father would arrive home to find my mother almost in tears because I would get halfway to the school bus stop, which was a 7-block walk from my home. I could only make half that walk because the cold would get too bitter for a small child to bear. I can still remember starting that bitter walk and the terrible cold that would cause my tears to freeze upon my face. I would return running as fast as I could. I had to cross a very busy avenue in order to catch the school bus, which would carry me more than 2 miles across town to the all-black Monroe Public School. These were the circumstances which so angered black parents. My father pondered why. Why should our children have to travel so far to school, facing unbearable winter weather, waiting for a badly overcrowded school bus to carry them some 2 miles across town when there is a school only 4 blocks from our home? Why? Why must I have to spend time trying to explain to my child that she cannot go to school with her neighborhood playmates, who are predominantly white, Native American, and Hispanic, because her skin is black? In the face of this discouragement, he, along with 12 other parents, met with the local NAACP and their lawyer, Charles S. Scott, a local attorney, to make plans for each family to try and enroll their child in the white school nearest their home during September 1950. After trying enrollment and being turned down, a suit was filed in federal court in February of 1951. During the following July, the federal 3-judge panel heard testimony from my father, along with several of the other parents, who agreed that segregated schools for blacks were unequal. I, along with my father, had to appear in court, but unlike him, I was not asked to appear on the witness stand. The case was argued before a 3-judge federal court in Topeka and was decided in favor of the Board of Education and its segregated elementary schools. In Topeka, the issue was not so much integrating public schools to improve the quality of instruction, but rather the inaccessibility of the neighborhood schools. Black people were able to live all over town, but could not expect to send their children to the schools closest to their home. At the Supreme Court level, the case was consolidated with similar cases and argued in terms of the psychological damage brought about by segregation in public education. Experts from the psychiatric community were pulled in to examine whether or not segregation, in fact, served to break a youngster's morale and block the development of a strong, positive self-concept so essential to educational progress. My family became lost in the turmoil of the ensuing years that scarcely touched us. We lived in the calm of the hurricane's eye, gazing out at the storm around us and wondering how it would all end. I don't think my father ever got discouraged, but at this particular time, neither I nor my parents knew how far-reaching this suit would become. During the next 3 years, while the now famous decision was in the making, my father was called into the ministry. He received a charge in the fall of 1953, and the family moved to the northern part of the city, where we became the first family of the St. Mark AME Church. I was transferred to the all-black McKinley Elementary School in North Topeka, again facing the same situation of having to walk twice the distance it would have taken me to reach the all-white school just 3 blocks from my home. Time stood still as the highest court of the land pondered over Brown versus Board of Education until an afternoon in May of 1954, when I was in school, my father at work, and my mother at home doing the family ironing and listening to the radio. At 12:52 p.m., the announcement came. The court's decision on ending segregation was unanimous. My mother was overwhelmed. On returning from school, I learned of the decision, which at that time meant only to me that my sisters wouldn't have to walk so far to school the next fall. That evening in our home was much rejoicing. I remember seeing tears of joy in the eyes of my father as he embraced us, repeating, "Thanks be unto God." That night, the family attended a rally given by the local NAACP and held at the Monroe Public School. The following school term was so very different, but not for me, because I was never to benefit from the now famous decision. For during the 54 school term, I entered junior high school, which was already on an integrated basis, as were the high schools in the city. Integration in the city in the fall of 1954 went very smoothly. It seemed as though blacks and whites had been going to school together for years. Neither I nor my family suffered the abuse or racial strife that marked integration in the latter 50s and early 60s in so many parts of the country. We were very fortunate, my father would often say. He believed very strongly that God would move people to do the right thing. The latter 50s found my family living in Springfield, Missouri, where my father held the pastorate of Benton Avenue AME Church. At this time, newspapers and magazines began to do follow-ups on me and my family, because the significance of the Supreme Court decision, which carried our name, was beginning to really take hold throughout the country. It was during this time that I inherited much of the recognition that might have gone to my father had it not been for his untimely death in 1961 at the age of 42. If he had lived, I'm sure he would have become a strong civil rights activist in the movements of the 60s. Little did he know that years ago, when he stepped off the witness stand, he stepped into the pages of history. I didn't understand what was happening then, but it was clear that Brown versus the Board of Education was a necessary victory. It might have been a little flame, but it served to set off a mighty flame. To me, the impact of Brown is best seen in the increasing numbers of black professionals today. These are the people that after 1954 were able to have some degree of choice. This surely made a difference in their aspirations and their achievements. I ran across a quote in a new book by one of our black women authors, and her name is Mildred Pitts Walters, that I believe says it all. It is not the treatment of a people that degrades them, but their acceptance of it. Thank you.
To pick up today some baseball cards.
Ah.
And I wondered if I could just this is sort of a name recognition, and if there's
Sure.
a vignette or something as you look at these names, that would be terrific.
Yeah, Thurgood Marshall, whom I met when I was in 6th grade, and he was a young, skinny attorney pleading the case for the equalization of teacher salaries in Louisiana. Of course, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy. Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP, and one of those organizations that worked with us on everything. Jim Farmer, head of CORE, who really started the Freedom Rides. Mm-hmm. Ralph Abernathy, without whom we might not have had a Martin Luther King. Right. Ralph was a senior pastor to Martin. He gave in to Martin's leadership and agreed to be supportive of Martin's leadership in Montgomery. Otherwise, we would have had some of the traditional preacher fights and wrangles over leadership. A. Philip Randolph is the father of the civil rights movement in many ways, was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and went with Mary McLeod Bethune to see Franklin Roosevelt about desegregating factories during the war. Oh, yeah, I knew him as an older man. This is E.D. Nixon, who, with Ralph Abernathy, decided that Martin Luther King would be the better leader. And Whitney Young, who headed the Urban League and was professor of social work at Atlanta University, whom I knew most of my life. We used to call each other cousins. John Lewis, of course, who was a student when I was at the National Council of Churches. And when we saw John Lewis on television in Nashville, my wife and I decided we had to leave New York and the National Council of Churches and come back to the South. Yeah. But it was the inspiration of John Lewis. This is James Meredith and John Doar going into the University of Mississippi, Brown versus the Board of Education. That's a little before my time. I was not active, but that might be Bill Coleman, who later became Secretary of Transportation.
Did your paths cross with his?
All the time, later on, but I didn't know him back then. Of course, Rosa Parks, who in many ways was the mother of the movement.
What kind of lady was she?
She was the quietest, sweetest, and most humble person you ever want to meet.
Right.
And she was more like Mother Teresa than, say, Winnie Mandela.
Right.
And of course, Julian Bond, who was one of our youngest heroes, and who has remained, in fact, we just endowed a chair at University of Virginia in his honor. Of course, that looks like the March on Washington, which I attended, and Mr. McClark was the woman who developed the citizenship education program that I came back south to work with. Mm-hmm. I really came to work with Septima, but our offices, we were sharing offices in the SCLC building, and Martin started asking me to help him with his mail, and pretty soon, it took about 4 years, but I transitioned from the citizenship education program to SCLC. And this looks like Daisy Bates, who was one of the parent who led the fight for the Little Rock Nine. And Fannie Lou Hamer, whom I helped to recruit into the movement from Ruleville, Mississippi, and whom I went to get out of jail in 1963 when she had been jailed in Winona, Mississippi, and beaten for 3 or 4 days simply because she wouldn't say sir. Right. Fred Shuttlesworth is the father of the Birmingham movement. Mm-hmm. And I've never known a more courageously crazy man. He just did not believe in any kind of, to think about it and be rational about it was against his nature. if it's wrong, confront it, take it on, no matter what the price. Ruby Hurley was the secretary for the NAACP in the Southeast for the early 60s and late 50s. Of course, Medgar Evers, who was assassinated in Mississippi in 1963, but who was the field secretary for the NAACP throughout Mississippi. Actually, I went to work with Martin in 1961 in Septimus Clark's program, but I was really an employee of the United Church of Christ. And I was sort of the administrator for the citizenship program, which Septima ran. But I ended up being pulled into training young people for the civil rights movement and assisting Martin in his mail and some of his correspondence.
But you happened to be in Memphis in '68 when he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. You were there principally, though, you were testifying at a hearing, weren't you?
Well, I was there testifying in behalf of we had been prevented from marching, and we went to federal court. And I had spent the day in federal court when Dr. King was prevented from marching, and we actually won the case. But as I came home and had been in court all day, we didn't have any cell phones in those days, so he hadn't heard from me all day long. And he started picking up pillows and throwing them at me, saying, "Where have you been? I haven't heard from you all day long. You have to keep me informed." And he started throwing pillows, and I started throwing them back. And it was, I mean, I'd never seen him quite so happy and frivolous. And 15 minutes later, he was gone.
The reason were you guys going to a reception? Was that the reason?
We were going to Billy Kyle's home for dinner.
When you heard the shot, did you think it was a shot, or?
No, I actually thought it was a car backfiring.
Really?
And I had no idea it was a shot. And then I looked up on the balcony and I saw that he was not on the balcony. And I actually thought he was clowning and had, sort of gone back into the room. And then I saw his shoes sticking out under the balcony.
Did you get a sense as far as, did they have an identification pretty immediately where the shots came from? And
we were pointing across the street to where the shots came from. Now, the shots could have come from, there were many people that said they saw shots coming from some azalea bushes that were about 6 or 8 feet tall. And the FBI decided that it came from the window, the bathroom window. It really didn't make much difference to us then, but interestingly enough, when we came back from the hospital, the Memphis Parks Department was cutting down all those bushes and swept that whole area clean. So they were at least complicit to the extent that they destroyed the crime scene.
Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power to move the nation.
ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Meredith.
You all cut that part out. But
It wasn't in there. I know what you're talking about.
The first thing that Governor Boris Barnett said, which one of you is James Meredith? Yeah. Now, you understand.
I was looking for
That was the second time he'd done that joke. And he later told my wife that he did it that time, which you didn't show, because it came over so big the first time when there wasn't no TV camera. He had to do it before the camera. I'm certainly sure, although he never told me this, but I'm almost positive that most of the shenanigans that Governor Barnett pulled off was designed to protect the black people in Mississippi. I mean, because, like when he called them, all of the law officers, officials, all of called to Jackson to protect him from the feds. He knew the feds wasn't coming to arrest him. What he really wanted all those sheriffs and other people to do was to come where he could watch over them so they wouldn't take things in their own hand and mistreat blacks all over the state. Now, so, I mean, I have long believed that most whites were as dissatisfied with the status quo as any black.
Now, you also sought out the NAACP and wrote a letter to then Thurgood Marshall. Why did you seek their involvement? Was this just legal protection at this point?
Well, basically, that was Medgar Evers. He wanted to get the NAACP involved, and he almost got real big trouble because, you know, the NAACP is one thing, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is another. And he didn't contact the NAACP lawyer. He contacted Thurgood Marshall, which was a different group. And so that's how that came about.
Although Thurgood Marshall remarked that this man has got to be crazy to challenge Mississippi officials, he assigned the case to Constance Baker Motley, who we saw in the film.
If I had to credit one single person for making things happen, it was her. Because well, she not only was a woman, she was a brilliant woman. I mean, she knew how to get what she wanted out of me. I don't think nobody else could have done that. All of those things that you see in the movie were nothing but games. And I knew they were games. You understand that? I mean, that was to get control of the population. I mean, I never would have gone to Ole Miss if I hadn't known that the Kennedys was going to send the 101st and the 82nd and all them other crack troops. You understand? Without that commitment, which they didn't want to make because they was then hoping to be a second-term president. So, I mean, but you understand, I mean, without my personal knowledge that the military was not only on alert but was coming, I would have never went. You see, my belief always is a good soldier ain't never a dead soldier. A good soldier is one that's always around to fight.
Did they let you know that they were ready to use the troops?
You better believe it or I wouldn't have went.
Did you fear for yourself?
Well, you know, I don't know really how to answer that. I mean, because fear got to, you see, philosophy is really important. Now, I had fear, but my only fear was not being successful in accomplishing my mission. And my mission was to live. As far as I was concerned, I'd been dead all my life. If I hadn't been dead, I wouldn't have got behind the black curtain on the Greyhound bus. You understand? I was a dead man. I was fighting to live. So most people talk about fear, they talking about dying, living. That it didn't mean much to me. I mean that because, you know, I have believed, you see, before I went into the Air Force, as a senior in high school, the American Legion had a contest, why I'm proud to be an American. And I entered that contest and won. Now, because I really believe that America, and my theory was, I'm not proud to be in America for what it is, but for what it can become. And I really believe that. And I still believe that. It ain't there yet. Don't want nobody to get that idea. But I genuinely believe that.
1962, and you actually go and meet Registrar Ellis. What were you thinking? If all of a sudden they handed you a pen and said, you've done it.
I was thinking that the Registrar Ellis was the only man on the campus with spirit. I mean, in spite of him saying register.
Did your paths cross with Ross Barnett's afterwards?
Oh, many, many times. I mean, as a matter of fact, I like to think it was the best restaurant in Mississippi, the LaFleur's restaurant. And I never seen him when he didn't shake my hand. Not once. My goal was to make every black boy feel like that he was superior to me, and if old James Meredith can make it, I can make it. And it literally turned out that way. Everybody felt sorry and pity for James Meredith. For one time, they was talking about how I was going to fail, and I encouraged it to the hilt. You understand? Because, first of all, I think I made 1B. But it was very important for the mass of the people to think that there's this struggle and scuffle, James Meredith. And then when I make it, oh boy. And it has, I'm pretty sure turned out that way. I don't want to take credit, but I know that was my goal. But the single most significant thing that I think has happened in my life was October last year at the University of Mississippi when they put up a statue of James Meredith between the Lyceum building, which is not only well known but going to be known for a long time, and the library. Because I don't know exactly what it means. I don't have no good reason to believe that the university even know what they intended to try to do. But I consider it the most significant thing, not really for me, but for the black-white race issue in America.
Your sharing these stories with us has been extra special. Ladies and gentlemen, James Meredith.
James Meredith tried again to register at the University of Mississippi, this time at its Jackson office, and this time accompanied by John Doar of the Justice Department and U.S. Marshal James McShane.
Funny thing happened there when we came down that hall that you saw the police coming down this narrow hallway, and I thought that we were going to go through a door at the end of the hall, but as we got, I was first, and then Meredith followed me, and then McShane, and when we got to the end of the hall, the door to which I thought we were going to enter was closed, and we were kind of moved sideways, and a door on the side of the hall opened, and there stood the Honorable Ross Barnett, and the television cameras came down over my shoulder, as I remember it, and before Barnett spoke, at length he looked at me, and then he looked at Meredith, and then he looked at McShane, and he said, "Which one of you is James Meredith?"
Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power to move the nation.
Well, obviously he was a courageous man. He had lots of nerve. And he was stubborn, persistent. He knew his own mind, and nobody was going to tell him what he should do or what he should not do. This segregation of blacks throughout the South and many places in the country would not have been solved with military. The strategy was focused on voting. And if ever we've seen a situation where the strategy is judged by the results, just look at what happened last week or on Tuesday. I mean, this is... Nobody in the world can believe that we did it. There hasn't been a country in the history of the world that has ever been able to as effectively solve a race or religious problem like this country has solved the race problem.
Referred to as the Gary Cooper of the Kennedy civil rights team. I know you're humble about all this stuff, but
you know, newspaper people, when they get stuck, they make it up.
Well, here's one of those articles. As bottles, bricks, and stones began to crash around him, he urged the crowd to disperse, reminding them that Medgar Evers wouldn't want them to resort to violence. He asked for help in moving people along, and surprisingly, many listened and complied. I believe that had John Doar not done what he did, many people would have been killed, said Mr. Henderson. There would have been a riot of epic proportions. Goes on. It is impossible to imagine what direction the civil rights movement would have turned that day without Doar. A man trained for a courtroom, not to calm an angry crowd. That wasn't his job. He was only there because he was a friend of Evers and wanted to pay his respect. Doar told Charles Portis of the Los Angeles Times that he took his life in his own hands because, quote, it seemed the only thing to do. Portis went on in his article, said, quote, the Justice Department's John Doar, a 6'2", 41-year-old unflappable Irishman from Wisconsin, is becoming the Marshall Dillon of the troubled South.
And all I can say is, what are you going to do when what am I going to do when I hear this? It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Tell you about the students really were heroes. That Bob Moses, Diane Nash, Chuck McDew, John Lewis, they were really put themselves in really danger. And what Bob always says is that the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice gave them crawling space in Mississippi in 1961 through 1964. Just gave them crawling space. They had just a little room to move around. And they kept at it, and they kept at this voting, and urging people to go down to register. By 63, conducting mock elections because for governor and for the various federal officials that were up for office.
Monday, June 22nd, 1964, you get a call at your home in Chevy Chase, Maryland. On the line was Mary King, a staff worker in the Atlanta office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. King told Doar alarming news. On the first day of the Freedom Summer, 3 civil rights workers were missing in east central Mississippi. King explained that Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Cheney had set out from Meridian on Sunday morning in a blue station wagon to investigate a church bombing in rural Neshoba County, a known high-risk area. When the 3 failed to return in the afternoon as scheduled, movement workers called local hospitals, jails, and law enforcement offices. The calls yield no word on the whereabouts of the civil rights worker. Could Doar help? King asked. What was your response when you got that call?
Well, we called the bureau right away and asked them to conduct an investigation. There was no hesitancy about initiating an investigation, and it was that investigation that really changed the attitude and the effectiveness of the FBI. Before that, the FBI was not a very effective law enforcement agency in the South on civil rights matters. But after that tragedy occurred, President Johnson sent Allen Dulles down to Mississippi to make an investigation, and he came back, and among the things he recommended was that Mr. Hoover beef up the FBI capability in Mississippi, and Mr. Hoover did that.
Portions of your closing statement. I wonder if you would read those last two paragraphs, because at least for those who have been Jackson fans, you'll see the connection.
This is an important case. It's important to the government. It's important to the defendants, but most important, it's important to the state of Mississippi. What I say here, what the other lawyers say here today, what the court says about the law will be soon forgotten. But what you 12 people do here today will long be remembered. Then I went on to say the defendants will stand before you on this record in the case, and they will beg of you of indulgence. In effect, they will say, as Gloucester said as he stood over the body of his slain king, say I slew him not. The king replied, then say they were not slain, but they are dead. If you find that these men are not guilty of this conspiracy, it would be as true to say that there was no nighttime release from jail by Cecil Price. There were no white knights. There were no young men dead. There was no murder. If you find that these men are not guilty, you will declare the law of Neshoba County to be the law of the state of Mississippi.
The proudest part of my career would be, how would you fill in that blank?
Proudest part was working in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, enforcing federal law with respect to free opportunity for all citizens to vote, free of discrimination.
Conclusion that Professor Neeson used when they honored you. And he concludes, I just think that you deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, John Doar. John Doar, a true American hero. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
One Sunday morning I was in there, and Bobby, first thing Bobby said to me, he said, I meant to be on Meet the Press this morning. I'm just tied up with this Mississippi thing. Will you go on and do it for me? I'll tell them. So I did. And I came back and I had some work to do, and about 1 o'clock, 1:30, I went into his office and said, I'm going home now. Anything you want me to do? And he said, you got anything important on this afternoon? I said, no. He said, would you mind going down to Mississippi and taking charge of the thing down there? He said, we don't have any senior official down there. And he said, I think if things go wrong, we'll be heavily criticized if we don't have somebody down there who's senior. And I can't go. He couldn't go. I mean, he would have started a riot just by being there. So I said, no, it's okay. I'll go. He said, I'll get a plane, take you. About then, my assistant, Harold Reese, stuck his head in the door. Bobby said, oh, Harold, he said, you got anything important on this afternoon? And Harold said, no. And Bobby said, well, how about you going with Nick down to Mississippi? So we did. We got a plane and went down there, and I don't know. I don't really know what we could have done. I've always thought it was a failure. But it was mostly, at least I like to blame it on the university more than I do on anything else. I mean, we were down there. It became obvious as the kids were coming back. We had Colonel Birdsong and the Highway Patrol was there, and it was obvious we had all these marshals with their helmets on and tear gas and so forth, and big armbands. And it was obvious that they were very annoying to the kids, and even early on, I asked the university, can we use the gymnasium so I can put away these 300 marshals or 400 marshals, whatever I had? The university said no. I had no place to put them. We were in the Athenaeum building, which was a sacred building to them and the Ole Miss, and by the Grove there. And it probably was the most irritating place we could have picked, but I didn't know any better. I didn't know anything about Ole Miss. I don't think anybody did. And then we had the developments, and Colonel Birdsong decided to pull out, and kids were throwing rocks and taunts and so forth and so on, and they got built up, and then they let the marshals use tear gas. It was getting pretty bad.
The situation in Oxford was becoming very tense as hundreds of people streamed into the area to defend Ole Miss and the Southern way of life.
We had reports throughout, not merely the students, but of all kinds of people pouring in cars in order to prevent Meredith from being admitted to Ole Miss. One has to remember also that that was the squirrel hunting season in Mississippi, so there were literally hundreds, thousands of guns. Every pickup truck had a couple of guns in it, so that the situation was really very dangerous.
The next day, Sunday, September 30th. Finally, President Kennedy decided the time had come to enroll James Meredith at Ole Miss.
And all the world are upon you and upon all of us.
The marshals were ordered not to use guns against the rioters, who were shooting and throwing Molotov cocktails. And the rioters were targeting the media, smashing cameras and attacking reporters.
So then we had the military come in. They had enough troops come in down there to Oxford, Mississippi, they could have kept right on going, taking Cuba.
Was there any moment of physical danger for yourself?
I suppose there must have been. I don't know. I wasn't particularly conscious of it. It was all kind of funny. I mean, we had a radio communication set up, which we had planned on in case there was problems to control the marshals. And the radio, the big radio, was set up in the basement of the courthouse. And then we had another set, which was set up in the Athenaeum building, smaller, and then we had walkie-talkies. So we had communication throughout the area. We used that to know what was going on. To get permission to use tear gas and so forth, I put a dime in a payphone. It was only a dime then. And called the White House collect and got the president and Bobby on the phone and maintained that throughout the whole time. It was quite funny, really.
As an open line?
Open line the whole time.
Payphone collect?
From payphone collect to the White House, yep. And so we knew what...
Story. Chairman of MCI talking about this.
We knew what was going on. They didn't.
Right.
And the Army didn't. And of course, this made a lot of problems. And the Army, President Kennedy would say to the Army, "Where are the troops?" And the Army would say, "They're just now landing at Oxford, the airport there." And he would call me and say, "Are the troops there?" And I'd call the guy at the airport on the walkie-talkie. He said, "No troops around here." So we go back. The president was just furious at the Army, and it really wasn't their fault. They had no communications at all. and they had misunderstood some of the instructions badly. I don't know how, I don't know, but we had told them we didn't want loaded guns because if they had to be used, we wanted to come in without loaded guns because of fear that we thought we could control the marshals, but we didn't know about the Army. But they had interpreted that as having no guns at all. So they were all standing around ready to go, but they had no guns, so they had to find guns for all the Army and so forth.
Deployment of federal troops was exactly what Kennedy had wanted to avoid. The next day, Governor Barnett called the White House with an alternate plan.
I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. President. Yeah. I'll go up there myself.
Well, now, how long will it take you to get there?
And I'll get a microphone and tell them that you have agreed to be removed.
No, now, wait a minute. Wait a minute, Governor. Now, how long is it going to take you to get up there?
About an hour.
Now, I tell you what, if you want to go up there, then you call me from up there, and then we'll decide what we're going to do before you make any speeches about it.
This man has just died.
Did he die?
Yes.
Which one? State police?
That's state police.
Yeah. Well, you see, we got to get order up there, and that's what we thought we were going to have.
President, please, why don't you, can't you give an order up there to remove me?
How can I remove him, Governor, when there's a riot in the street, and he may step out of that building and something happened to him? I can't remove him under those conditions. Well, we've got to get somebody up there now to get order and stop the firing and the shooting. And then you and I'll talk about what's the best thing to do with Meredith.
While the president and the governor argued, the riot worsened. Finally, Katzenbach asked the White House for troops. It took hours for them to arrive, and during the night, 35 marshals were shot, and 2 people, a French journalist and an Oxford worker, were killed. But by dawn, the Army had restored order.
Of course the president's going to win in the end. He's got the whole armed forces of the United States. He can call in the Air Force. He can bring Navy ships up the Mississippi River. He can call out the Army as he did. He can drop parachuters in. I suppose he could shoot missiles at Oxford, Mississippi. So he's going to win at the end.
And later, James Meredith came to my private office, and I accommodated the registration there.
It wasn't a cause for laughter and champagne, but it was a cause for some relief, and it was the fact that was over with. I mean, in a way, Oxford had become the symbol of massive resistance and the final gasp of the Civil War, if you want to look at it that way. And it was over. It had ended.
It was a lonely victory for James Meredith, but it was a victory for him and the country. The Constitution had held and been reaffirmed in a major crisis. Thousands of black people felt the victory and saw James Meredith as an example to follow, a symbol, like the Little Rock Nine, of their own power.
It's my great pleasure to introduce one of the courageous, one of the beautiful sisters of the movement. I met Dorothy Cotton many, many years ago when we both were much younger. She was working with SCLC, working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., teaching people how to pass the so-called literacy test. Dorothy Cotton.
And I know I told you much more than you asked me, but...
Any other questions?
but I can come right from Goldsboro to Raleigh, then still in North Carolina, to Petersburg, Virginia, and then to moving to Atlanta, and then and moving up to Ithaca. I don't know which place is home. There. Anywhere I hang my hat is home. Anybody like the blues? But...
Okay. I just gonna. That was great.
I'm such a ham.
Well, it's great. I watched the Actors Studio, and he was doing an interview with Robin Williams.
Yeah.
And he never got a question in. I'm sensing this is where this is going.
Yeah, you have to watch me.
So,
yeah.
So if in fact that's okay.
You can put your hand up and I'll get the message.
No. We're here to learn about you.
I'm the education director, but guess what? When they needed a coffee, they Dorothy, could you? Well, we need somebody to take minutes, like women, like they can't write. And now, see, but the women's movement hadn't happened then. I'm talking about before the 70s when the women's movement happened. So when they, now I would say, now, Martin, let me show you. Now here's the way you make coffee. You put some coffee in, and then you push this button or plug it in or whatever you think that I would say that. But actually, it was a man, I'll never forget, Jack Odell on our staff, who said, Dr. King, Dorothy needs to stay in here, be a part of this discussion, because we're talking about, well, let's say we're talking about how we're going to go into Birmingham and respond to Reverend Shuttlesworth's invitation to come over to Birmingham. But the beginning of the citizenship education program, which is a program I really want people to know about, and this is why I emphasize we didn't just march. Nobody, and I don't care if the governor did stand there saying, you segregation now, segregation forever. But nobody can take away your privileges, and here the Supreme Law says that. A little bit here, but yeah, you have a right peaceably to assemble. Translated, that meant, we jolly well can march from Selma to Montgomery. Well, see, I already have a master's degree from Boston University, but I learned more about civics, as we used to call it, helping these people understand and put your flesh and blood, as they say, on meat on the bones of these documents on which the country was founded. You have a right peaceably to assemble. The violence was real, but so was the joy in realizing that we were at last doing something to change a really sorry state of affairs in the country. A sentence that I like to repeat a lot is that if things are going to change, we have to change it. You know, it was... You read the letter from a Birmingham jail, and the ministers who wrote a letter complaining about our being in Birmingham. They talked about, as many people did, wait, cool off. And, somebody said, this wasn't Dr. King, said, if we wait any longer, we'll be in a deep freeze. And how much longer do we have to wait for very, very basic rights?
How much did the songs of the movement become part of your citizenship?
They were incredibly important because, I don't know, do black folks, do we just sing all the time, y'all? We pretty much, in the churches, in some of the churches in the South, I don't know if y'all sing in your church. I used to go to church and people just could strike up a song, or if somebody started a song, somebody else would jump in and help them out. What the Spirit says to everybody. What the Spirit says do, I'm going to do, oh Lord. I'm going to do what the Spirit says. Okay, let's do it. I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. For what the Spirit says to do, I'm going to do, oh Lord. I'm going to do what the Spirit says to do. We got voter registration drive. I don't know if you asked me about the songs, but the songs came out of, as I said, the sorrow songs, the songs of hope, the songs of celebration. Out of every mood, there were songs. I don't know if we would have had a civil rights struggle movement had it not been for the singing. When we talk about organizing a nonviolent campaign, there are very specific steps that I use, and a lot of people, us who work together, use this pattern, but it's about college students say, well, what do we do about whatever? I said, well, what do you want to do? Okay, they have no answer. Okay, you want to organize a campaign? Let me tell you how you organize. First, you get the facts. But the last step in a nonviolent campaign is always reconciliation. If that is the goal. It's what Martin Gandhi said, it's what Martin Luther King said, it's what Jesus said, it's what Buddha said, it's what all the great spiritual teachers in the universe The idea is to learn how to work together. We don't even know how to have dialogue. But anyway, 6 steps on a nonviolent campaign. Maybe we can do a workshop on that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dorothy Cotton.
Come by here, my Lord. I don't know if we would have had a movement had we not sung together. We sang from the many moods and experiences that we were going through. We actually could tell the whole story of that great struggle that rearranged the social order in this country. We could tell the whole story through its music.
Bill Plante has covered much of what's gone on in the last 40 years in the United States. I'm thrilled and honored to introduce Bill Plante.
Thank you very much, Greg. I wish I could have been with you in March, but you saw me glowing in the dark after Chernobyl, right? Which was a fun trip. Another story. I'm delighted to be here. I was hoping that I could be with you in March, but that didn't work out, so I'm very glad that this did. I'm very glad because the 100th anniversary of Justice Marshall's birth provides a wonderful takeoff point for me to talk about what I first did when I came into network news. Now, I hasten to add, I was asked to be brief, and I will be. I mean, for those of us in television, brevity is the usual. We get a minute and a half. In fact, there's, of course, a story that I love, which I think I first heard from David Brinkley, which has it that if television had been invented when the Ten Commandments were handed down, the report would have gone something like this. Good evening. From CBS News, this is Newsbreak. At Mount Sinai today, God gave Moses 10 commandments. Here are the 3 most important. So in that spirit, let me tell you why I am really delighted to be here on Justice Marshall's birthday. The civil rights movement was the first thing that I covered when I went to work for CBS News. Was I prepared to do that? Not in any real sense. I'm from Chicago. I had never been further south than St. Louis. I was sent to Philadelphia, Mississippi in summer of 1964, where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered. I might as well have gone to the dark side of the moon for all I understood about what I was about to see and experience. So I have, I think, an appreciation for the work that Justice Marshall did in preparing the way for the civil rights movement that I then reported on for the next several years. My wife and I had the opportunity to see the play Thurgood, which is on Broadway, the work of George Stevens. Roger was the founder of the Kennedy Center. I get them confused. George Stevens Jr. wrote Thurgood, and it's a wonderful picture, a wonderful portrait of Justice Marshall and his devotion to the rule of law. It illustrates how Marshall's work with the NAACP in the 30s, 40s, and 50s built the foundation for the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and 70s. In the play, there is a line very well delivered by Lawrence Fishburne, who's wonderful in the part, which has Justice Marshall laughing over the idea that after Brown, well, in 5 years, most of the schools would be desegregated. Laughable indeed. I was in high school when Brown was announced. I remember thinking with all the satisfied certainty of a 16-year-old, well, that's the end of segregation. Good. But of course, no such thing. But as Thurgood Marshall moved onto the bench, in 1961, the careful and thorough legal approach which he constructed and charted continued. By the time I began working for CBS News in 1964, the civil rights movement had begun in earnest the push for voting rights. The headlines were in the clashes, the arrests, the murderous outrages. But the foundation was the foundation that Thurgood Marshall had put in place, anchored firmly to the rule of law. There was tension between the civil disobedience of Dr. King and the idea of the rule of law. Roger Stevens alludes to it in, George Stevens alludes to it in the play when he has Marshall suggest that he didn't always agree with Dr. King's tactics. As Stevens put it to me in a conversation, Thurgood thought that you shouldn't break the law. But at the NAACP in the 50s, he defended the Freedom Riders and the Civil Rights demonstrators. In the play, Stevens has Marshall grumbling a little bit about the fact that they got stuck with the cost of all that. But he just grumbles a bit. The foundation that Thurgood Marshall laid down was in place when Dr. King began his voter registration drives in Alabama in 1965 in January. And that's when I began to cover him regularly. And after the violent clash at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in March, which you saw in my wife's film, the drive culminated in the march from Selma to Montgomery in late March of that year. But the legal battle continued in the courts while the demonstrations went on in the streets. And it was just as key as the demonstrations. I went back and looked at a report that I wrote in early February of 1965. It was for radio. And here's what it said. The battle going on in the courts is more important in many respects. But the demonstrations in the streets provide the drama lacking in the courtroom. So, though a federal injunction last week ordered a speed up in registration, the marching on the Dallas County Courthouse will continue because Negro leaders hope to force the registrar's office to take applicants more often than the 2 days a month provided for by state law. The tension continued as well. Another report from around the same time. There are voices of moderation counseling the Negro leadership to stop demonstrating. The Justice Department reportedly has made a request for an end to the demonstrations. We who covered the movement watched as it provided the impetus that led up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was signed in August. As with Brown, the hopeful assumption that the Voting Rights Act would quickly remedy the inequalities in registration was way too optimistic. The law had to continue to work. The strategy of law underpinned by the strategy of nonviolence underpinned by the rule of law came under a great deal of pressure after the emotional high point of the voting rights signing, because just 5 days later, the riots broke out in Watts. Watts was the first violent uprising of the 60s, a time when the rule of law seemed to be disconnected from the social fabric. Militants applauded the upsetting of order. Conservatives saw it as the consequences of civil rights legislation gone way too far. So I guess in retrospect, it seems to me that the creative tension which existed between the law as Marshall championed it and the push for urgent change is what delivered the most lasting results. And in the end, it is the appeal that people like Justice Marshall made through the law and Dr. King made through his personal witness to what Lincoln so famously called the better angels of our nature, that is what distinguishes us as a people. Thank you very much.
What happened in Jamestown, there's three of us, Reverend Williams up at the Church of God, and Jerry Daniels over at the Emmanuel Lutheran Church. We got together and we decided to do something. I was in a heck of a position. My mother-in-law lived with us at that time. She was a good gal. And she was in New York City having surgery on her eye. My wife was down there to be at her side. And so I had 6 kids at home. We were very busy, my wife and I, in those days. And I had those 6 kids to take care of. I'll tell you who took care of them. Alice Lavoie's mother, Leah Daniels, that's Reverend Williams' wife, and Bernie and his wife, Bernie Washington and his wife, they were the babysitters. So those people were willing to stay and take care of my kids while I was gone, and I got Martin Myers over at WCA Hospital to say, sure, you go ahead, George. And my wife said okay, and my boss said okay, so I was ready to go. The 3 of us, Ned Young and Joe Hodnett, drove us over to Erie. We met with the people from the Baptist church there, was the Shiloh Baptist Church, that's what it was. And Reverend McCartney, I think it was met the pastor. And they had a bus that they had arranged for to take their troop down. There was a whole bunch of people in there. There was only, I think, one other white guy besides Jerry Daniels. And there's a couple of newspaper men from the big cities and a guy from Erie. But the rest of the people were just people from that church over in Erie. And the ride down was, just a lot of talk. The kids were singing. A lot of them were teenagers. But when we got to Birmingham, it was beautiful. And from there on, we could see a lot of the people were upset. We were in the bus, and they were using bad fingers to us and stuff like that. But we saw no violence at all. We got a hold of some of the newspapers, and that's kind of interesting. The newspapers didn't say a word about the people coming into Montgomery. Not a word. They were talking about the legislature. There was a minister in the legislature who was scolding his fellow ministers for using strong language and drinking liquor on the streets and whatnot, saying things like that. There's a Catholic bishop who was given a scolding to Martin Luther King. They weren't talking about the people who were coming into Montgomery, and the place was loaded. What Wallace had done is he closed up all the public parking lots. So all the people who were coming in cars, and the marchers weren't the only ones there. There's cars coming in, airplanes were coming in, buses were coming in, and it was an awful mess. And none of the parking lots were available. And we got there in the evening, just the evening before the actual move into Montgomery itself. And it seemed to be the center location was a campus, a college campus. It was the city of St. Jude was it was a college there in Montgomery. It was a black college, a black hospital, a black children's home. I think the school had 7, I think the story we were told said 7 white kids, it was full of black kids. And we were taken in there and herded around, and there's some Catholic priests, and I can remember them distinctly because I felt some kinship to them, because everybody's black, And these Catholic priests were showing us and telling us how to behave. Get down on your hands and knees and cover your faces, have a wet handkerchief with you, all that sort of thing. Protect yourselves from the expected onslaught of tear gas and so forth. And we heard the speeches. You have to understand, everybody is any import in the black community, and a lot of people in the white communities were down there. My gosh, the place was full of visiting dignitaries. You saw some of them in the parade, but Ralph Bunche was there, top man in the black community. He was the head of the UN at that time. And Sammy Davis Jr., I'd seen him just a couple of weeks before his play in New York. He was there. There were all sorts of people. And but they all just said a few words because they all wanted to get in there. Like they're all celebrities. They want to get their faces in. They said a few words, but they were all waiting for the final word, and then finally came up. Martin Luther King came there, and he had still had his rubber boots on, mud splattered. He looked the part of a real pilgrim. And he just spoke for a short time and urged that everybody be there. Was hoping that the people in Montgomery would join the parade the next day. And they didn't. They didn't. It was kind of surprising to us when we were marching with, like I said, the SNP kids watching us. But the local people, they didn't come out on the curbs very much, not very many of them. It wasn't through disinterest, I'm sure. It was through a fear of retribution. They would have been told that if they participated, they'd lose their jobs and all that sort of thing. So, but the night we were there, the people in that community, that was the so-called colored section of Montgomery, they opened their houses and everybody flocked in. And I was there with my two friends, and I shared a bed with a Baptist preacher from Washington, and the people just opened their hearts, and they fed us and took care of us, and we sat up till 2 o'clock in the morning talking, and got up at 7 o'clock in the morning, get ready to march. Marching in, and I talked about it in a little book I wrote, but the people who were along the streets, who were brave enough to do it, and they were the old ones. They were the ones that didn't have jobs to do. They would come out and shake our hands and do things like that to let us know that we were welcome and they were glad to see us. And some of those I'd rather not talk about because they were very ennobling moments for me. But we finally marched into the city, and of course I think you all know that Wallace didn't show up. The plan had been the announced plan was for King to go up to the door of the Capitol and charge Wallace with all the things that we had against him. But Wallace didn't show up, so King arrived there and wasn't anything to do, so everything was anticlimactic at that point. And that was the end of the march, and it was to break up. And it was after that that everybody dispersed, and there's people going around saying, now get on your buses and go, keep together and don't cause any trouble, etc. and so forth. And that's what happened. We finally got on our bus the way we went. The only high mark was in Birmingham. We stopped in Birmingham for a rest stop, and the people in Birmingham, in the colored section, opened their hearts to us. And I never ate so much fried chicken in my life. My first initiation to soul food, I guess. And there's one thing interesting there. I never talked about this before, but it was, as a Catholic, it was surprising to me to see this house one house that we seemed to be more time more than other houses had religious pictures on the wall, and they were all Catholic pictures. Pictures like St. Teresa and things like that, which I thought was most unusual. Nobody ever explained to me what that was all about, but there must have been more than just Baptists down there. But it was interesting, and they were all crying and feeding us, and we had a lot of fun for about an hour or so. Get on the bus and make it back to Erie, and finally I ended up at Jamestown. And that's all I have to say.
We knew that our black friends lived in a certain part of town, but they participated in everything at the high school that I participated in. So I went away to seminary, to college, at Houghton College down here in Allegheny County, so that really didn't expose me to much of America's social conflict. And finally I went to Chicago, to the suburbs of Chicago, to seminary, to a school sponsored at the time by the Evangelical United Brethren Church, which I was a member of. And I started going as a youth minister to Chicago, to an inner city church in Chicago. It was primarily a white church in terms of it wasn't very well integrated, but the ministers there and the people at the church were very involved, became very involved in what we called integration. The fact that our church and the community itself needed to be open, and it needed to have people. We didn't, segregation after Brown versus Board became a bad word, I think. It was also a time, not only was I getting personally educated, but it was a
time of great positive feeling. It was a time of idealism. I mean, students like myself were in an urban community like this, became very involved in these issues and went to meetings and rallies and things like that. Our church on the near north side of Chicago decided, because one of our ministers had gone to seminary with a gentleman who was now the chaplain of Tougaloo College outside of Jackson, Mississippi. And this was a white guy by the name of Ed King, but he was the chaplain at Tougaloo College, which was an all-black school. And the issue became, I was working in a Methodist church, and eventually the United Brethren became Methodist. I don't know if any of you folks go back to that time. But anyway, at the time we were not Methodist, but I was working in a Methodist church. And in the Methodist church, there was a segregated system called the central jurisdiction of the Methodist church. And it came out of Jim Crow in the South, and basically the black Methodist churches in the South were all black. They were part of the Methodist church. In the Methodist churches in the South, who called Methodist churches, were all white. And never the twain shall meet. And around Chicago and places like that, we'd have interracial congregations and stuff. But it became apparent that this was a big issue, especially in the South in the Methodist church. So we started doing interracial church visitations. And Ed King, who was the minister and the chaplain at Tougaloo College, would call his buddies up in Chicago and say, well, send me 3 more people next Friday. So next Sunday, we're going to visit the such and such church. All white churches, of course. And we'd pick up a black student or 2 at Tougaloo College, and we'd go as an integrated group to church. And people had gotten arrested. Guy got thrown in jail. The night I went, we drove down from Chicago. Maybe it was early on Friday. We got there late Friday night and met the guy. His name was Tom Strong. I remember this young student that I was going to go with, and another guy to church at the leading Methodist church, the Jackson Street Methodist Church, whatever it was called in Jackson, Mississippi. I can't even remember it now. But I remember the night before going, though, and we got briefed by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I met a guy by the name of Mickey Schwerner. And Schwerner had also gave me a sales pitch about coming back for the registration program in the summer of '64, which I told him I might do it. Later on, it worked out. I had to stay in Chicago at this church and I was a youth minister. I wasn't ordained, but I was a student and I was working at this church. But I remember the night before when they told us how to roll if we got hit, and how to cover our genitals, and how to put our arms over our back, and things like that. And then the final advice was, you're going to have 1 phone call you're going to be able to make. That's it. So don't take anything more than a quarter in your pocket, because you'll never see the rest of it if you take any more money. And here's the phone number. Write it now in the palm of your hand. So we all wrote the phone number in the palm of our hand. And the next morning, we went in a car to church. And it was amazing. Tom, this young black student, he was just shaking like a leaf. I mean, me, I was from Chicago, Jamestown. They can't be that bad down there. We went to the church, but we'd been told not to push it too far because there was already a couple of people from the prior week in jail, and they didn't have any bail money. They didn't want more to go into this jail. So we went up to the front of the church, and one of the sextons or the members of the chief board of trustees or something came down the steps and met us. He was very cordial. I'm sorry you can't come in. I'm sorry you can't come in. We argued with him for a while until a couple of cop cars with corn poppers started coming up by the front steps of the church. When we said, all right, thank you. He said, I will meet with you Monday morning in my office if you stay. So we ended up staying through Monday and went to meet with this fella. And then there was just a couple of other experiences I remember. We went to a black church that night. We left the Methodist church and guess where we went to church? We went to a Catholic church. Because the Pope had said, we don't believe in segregation. I don't care where you live, in Mississippi or wherever you are. We don't do it that way. And so we went, it was an integrated service. I mean, in Jackson, Mississippi, but it was Roman Catholic. And so we went there for church. went back to the college and came back to a black church at night. And they were all welcoming us and thanking us, and we had a nice dinner there, as I remember. And then they sang an old spiritual that I'd never heard before, but I still remember the words. Soon we'll be done with the troubles of the world. We're going to go home and live with God. That's it. Oh my gosh, I'd never heard that in Chicago or Jamestown or any place. I heard them singing this song, and I said, wow, this is big. But it was a heady time. It was an idealistic time. Later in the summer, Martin Luther King came to Chicago, went to the Soldiers Field to see him speak. And then I'll just say that by the end of my seminary years, and I decided not to get ordained for a lot of different reasons, I went back and graduated from the seminary. But by 1966, things had soured more. I mean, there had been riots in the cities. White people were not as welcome, I don't think, as to be a part of the civil rights movement. It had sort of gone over a certain ledge and was going in a little different direction. And Martin Luther King had problems with his own people. I mean, it got a little bit testy. I mean, if some people didn't think the movement was moving fast enough. And King was trying to make sure that it didn't go too fast so that the country would come along with it. But it was 64 was a wonderful time to be alive, and it changed my life a lot because I was introduced to issues in the world that here in Chautauqua County I'd never realized existed, and had a small little piece to play that one weekend, and the church that I worked in was quite involved in the civil rights movement. And then I was lucky, I guess, that the church wanted me to come and work for them that summer, so I didn't go back to Mississippi. If I would have gone down to Schwerner was one of the 3 guys that was killed in Philadelphia and was buried in that pond, that impoundment of that pond in Mississippi. So I never saw him again. But thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Alan.
The troubles of the world, troubles of the world, troubles of the world. Soon we'll be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God.